So you were part of a collaboration with Google about machine learning and performance. I'm curious, what led to this collaboration?
So almost a year ago, the folks at Google, primarily Pat Meenan, who is creator of Web Page Test, among other things, and Daniel On, who's a project manager there, who leads mobile search and mobile ads. They wanted to do, so at Google they've been doing a lot of research with their AI, and they're just basically throwing AI at everything and just sort of seeing what sticks, seeing what they can learn from it in different contexts. And they really wanted to do something around performance, partly to give some material to their ads team to show just using Google sanctioned study that that performance matters in terms of conversions and bounce rate. And they approached us at SOASTA because we're, I guess, the only rum vendor that actually, we not only serve a lot of retail clients, retail customers, but we actually store and keep 100% of the user data that we gather in perpetuity. So it kind of logically it was a really good relationship because we could just give them our data to put into their AI and do the learning that they wanted to learn.
Ah, very cool.
Yeah.
And what were some of the results of that research?
It was really interesting. So when we started the project, we didn't have any hypotheses. We were just taking about 1.1 million beacons worth of user data, so gathering just about 93 different attributes that the beacon gathers for each user, and throwing it into the AI and applying machine learning to it, and just sort of wanted to see what would happen. And what we found were some kind of obvious connections, like pages that were contained fewer images, therefore were leaner, tended to, sessions that had those leaner pages tended to convert more, tended to bounce less, things like that. So it validated some things that we all kind of know intuitively. So that was kind of good to sanity check that our research actually made sense and that our process made sense. But then there were a few curveballs, and I didn't realize that I actually had assumptions about these things until the data showed me otherwise. So one example was that when we looked at what are some of the page metrics that affected conversions more or affected bounce rate more or less. One example is page load time. So in the past couple of years, page load time has become a bit of a dinosaur in terms of metrics, at least in how we talk about them. A lot of people are kind of dismissing load time as a metric. It's something, well, we used to do that because it was the only metric we could gather, but now it doesn't really measure the user experience because it encompasses too much of the page. And so, and logically that all makes sense. But what we found actually was that page load time is still a very significant metric. It actually was the second most relevant metric in terms of predicting bounce rate in a session. So that was really interesting and kind of revived and resuscitated page load, which was kind of heading on its way out, in my mind anyways. And then the other really interesting one was start render. So start render, which is when it doesn't necessarily measure when elements are visible in the browser, but at least shows when the page begins to render. It could be render anything. There's no perfect metric for measuring user experience, but start render has become at least one that we think, oh, okay, well, intuitively that makes sense. You know, when the page begins to render is probably an indicator of user experience. It in our study of the 93 different attributes, it ranked 69. So it was like, okay. I mean, all of the attributes mattered. There was no attribute that did not have some impact on performance, but it was way, way, way out in the weeds. So that was very eye-opening as well, and a little bit humbling because I'm one of the people who's been out there staying on stages saying, you know, death to full load and yay, start render.
So this research has, in some ways, maybe it resurrects some old practices that were previous common wisdom. Totally. Does it suggest any new practices?
Well, I mean, the larger practice of just using machine learning on your own data. I mean, that's the takeaway at the end of our talk. When Pat and I presented this, was that this is what we learned from looking at a lot of anonymized aggregated data from some leading retailers. But you really need to look at your own data. And machine learning, I mean, Pat shared the code on GitHub for people to do this themselves. It's not onerous. You can do it on a laptop.
Yep.
It's just about kind of getting in there and just getting your hands dirty and starting to do it. And now that we have, since we have all this RUM data and we have machine learning as a tool, there's no reason to not start doing this on your own. So the takeaway there is that we want people to go away and just try it themselves.
Yeah. So there might be different answers for different people depending on the business they're in, the type of infrastructure they work with.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I would really be interested in seeing the results of somebody else's study. I would love to find out if it validated or negated our findings. I'm pretty open to that. I don't mind being wrong. It makes life more interesting.
Sure. Well, that's fascinating. So you recently, to pivot more to the business side of web performance, you recently wrote a book with O'Reilly called Time is Money, The Business Value of Web Performance. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about, what led you to write this book? What's the story behind it?
So it's kind of the sum total of everything that I've been writing about for the past 7 years, which is a little humbling when you see it like all in a little book. It's like, it's just my life work, no big deal. this set of pages. But it's a collection of research around the psychology of performance, why performance matters from a user experience perspective, and then some really great case studies. And I say great because they're great. They're not. I didn't come up with them. But some just really great research from a variety of different retail sites, media sites. A lot of different verticals, just showing the impact of performance on a variety of different metrics. And the reason why I wanted to write this book was because I talked to a lot of developers and people who work in kind of DevOps, performance engineers, and they get it. They've been reading this, but the really tricky thing for them has been communicating this to people who are not technical. And so having written a lot of blog posts, I'm told that that's helpful because they can send blog posts to people, but there's something very validating about it all being in a book, and especially if the book is published by O'Reilly, that I wrote the book as part, I hope, of developer or performance engineers toolkit when they're trying to educate people throughout the organization about why performance matters and why everybody who touches a page, whether they're in marketing or sales or whoever, if they're doing something on the page, it affects performance.
I see. Wonderful. Final question. I'm curious what your perspective is on the latest trends and what maybe the future of web performance is going to be over the next few years.
I think that it kind of comes down to the fact that we now have this unprecedented ability to learn about users, to capture that data, store it, and do interesting things with it. And so what I would like to see more research coming out, and I think it's around the corner, is third parties, like third-party performance, and specifically the performance of different types of third parties and the impact that it has on conversions, bounce rate, all those other business metrics. And we have the ability, in theory, the ability is there, the tools are there, the data is there to actually look at that, because just in the last 6 months or so, just with the explosion in ad blockers and just how much media coverage there's been over the issue of ads and other third parties on pages, we need to see some actual data and studies into that. And then the other one is just predictive analytics. It's the ability to use your own data to do modeling that lets you know about everything from anticipating traffic spikes to anything, to the impact of performance changes on future revenue, future conversions.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.